Now I start with the talk. Okay, so Bourbaki, a very, very short overview of the group. So this is one of the early pictures of the first meeting. I want to remind some people, the younger generation don't know about Bourbaki much, the older do, but it's always fun to see who were the members of Bourbaki or important mathematicians. So whether I can use this here, yes, I can. So we have Dieudonné who's here, we have André Veil who's here, you have Henri Cartan who's here, and also one of the very important players for me and also for Grothendieck later, this little guy here, the center is Claude Chevalier, who's a very important mathematician, also a very important member of the group. I'll tell you why I say that in a little while. So basically, Bourbaki was born in 1934, 1935. So this is 1935 in the summer. And they had a very simple goal in mind, which was only at the beginning to write a good textbook, in French on analysis, because the textbooks were old, they were old-fashioned, and they did not correspond to the standards of the time. So they decided to start from scratch. And actually, they are the ones who actually started by writing the prerequisites. Well, there are no prerequisites in this book, only some sort of mathematical maturity. To me, it was really frustrating when I read this, because I always felt that I didn't have the right mathematical maturity to read this stuff. But it meant also that they had to start from scratch. So they had to start with logics and sets and general topology and algebra and build up everything in this new framework where they have these structures that come from the German school of mathematics and they want to use to develop analysis. And it becomes, and I want to emphasize this, it becomes a very singular enterprise whose nature is very difficult to capture. So Bourbaki is not a research project. It's not a textbook that you read while you get new research, new results. And it's not a textbook in the standard sense. You don't learn something by reading Bourbaki's book. At least it wasn't meant that way. From a pedagogical point of view, it's a nightmare. But from a presentation point of view, with this perspective they have, which is foundational, is brilliant. This is taken later. This is an interesting picture, in fact, because you have Dieudonné here again, André Veil again, and this guy here is Sanders MacLean, who was there in the 50s. And here is Jean-Pierre Serre, who was a very young man at the time, but very influential. So you have the endorses from very early on. So if you read not the official things, but what is published in La Tribu, which is the notes from their meetings, and they write down whatever they're talking about, who said what. It's actually very funny to read. In fact, it's very silly at times. But very early on, you read that they endorse a form of structuralism in a very precise way. And it is described in a meta-mathematical term all along. And this comes from Claude Chevalier. It's very clear the way he thinks of it. And it's built on two notions. The first one is the notion of species of structure. And the other part is a methodological requirement that they make explicit in their volume. It is what we've just seen, the substitutional principle that Kevin talked about. And it is written down in Bourbaki as a requirement that any mathematical theory has to satisfy. Okay, and it just says, if X is a property P and X is isomorphic to Y, then Y should have property P. Well, they talk about transportable relations and transportable properties. So that's the way of talking. Is it for any P? Sorry? For any P? In the language of the theory. Okay, so you fix the language. It is based on sets. It is based on a set theory, but you build theory and then it restricts your language and it's built in. The only properties you'll write about these species of structures will be those that satisfy this requirement. So everything is actually done up to isomorphism if you respect the way they actually present the theories. But it's a methodological requirement, but it's also mixed up with all other things. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit why it is mixed up. They started in 1935. The book in which these principles appear is finally published in 1957. It took 20 years for Bourbaki to actually agree, and I'll tell you the whole story, not really, but they finally published. But the spirit of the whole thing is very clear. So you read this in 1939. Every proposition of a theory of the structure sigma of a certain type will be transportable in the same way by using the proper extensions and will yield a proposition of the theory of structures belonging to F of T. You transport the whole thing. This is an isomorphism, so everything is preserved. So very early on, you find these writings by the different members as what it means. And you have a very strong way of presenting this in this, what is sometimes called the manifesto by Bourbaki, the Architecture of Mathematics, which was written by Dieudonné, in fact, not by the whole group. And you have this footnote, which says, suffice it to say that the axiomatic studies of the 19th and 20th centuries have gradually replaced the initial pluralisms of the mental representations of these beings by a unitary concept, gradually reducing all the mathematical notions first to the concept of natural number, and then the second stage to the notion of set. And then they go on. From this new point of view, that's Bourbaki's point, mathematical structures become, properly speaking, the only objects of mathematics. Everything is done up to isomorphism. The underlying sets are there, but it's not actually what you have to work with. And you're working with structures. So this is another picture, that same group. You have the André Vail sisters here, Simone. Note the historical reference to the preceding quote. So things progress. There is a history of things progressing to now, which is structuralism in the 20th century. And what they say explicitly, and this is important for me and also for what I will be telling later, at various places, mathematical structures are abstracted from previous mathematical contexts. So the method of abstraction plays a key role in his way, or Bourbaki's way, of understanding the epistemology from an historical perspective. And so the axiomatic method, it's presented as the method of presenting what has been abstracted earlier. Okay, so you use the axioms to present the result of the process of abstraction. This gives you groups, rings, fields, logical spaces, metric spaces, and all these things. And essentially the species of the structure. So this is the book, the Théorie des Ensembles, which was finally published in 1957. So all the structures in Bourbaki's ontology are set-based. This is some sort of an incoherence in Bourbaki. He had to, and didn't find a way to circumvent this. But there's a problem and he's aware of it. Categories, functors, and natural transformations, as you know, were introduced by Eilenberg and MacLean in 1955, already in 1952. And it is important to know that members of Bourbaki learns and uses categories, functors, and natural transformations from early on. Grothendieck collaborates with Eilenberg from the late 40s and early 50s. Chevalier knows category theory from very early on. He's in the States. He works with Eilenberg and MacLean. He knows them. He's respected and he brings it back. But also, as I'll say later, members of Eilenberg will become a member of Bourbaki in 1950 because he works with Grothendieck. And so he will just join Bourbaki as a member. And here's what he has to say. So Bourbaki has this stance that mathematics is about abstract structures. There is about categories, and there's a problem. These are weird, okay? They don't fit in. And he's aware of that very early on. So he asks Eilenberg, can you solve that? And Eilenberg writes in unpublished notes, which were found by Ralph Koerman, the method of functors and categories is in some sort of competition with the method of structures as developed at present. Unless this competition is resolved, only one of these methods should be presented at the early stage in the books. Okay. Bourbaki is committed by structures for all the material of part one, at least as is in the set. Now we're in 1950. I want to remind you that category theory is not what you know as category. The notion of an equivalence of category is not in the text. Actually, no one knows about the notion of an equivalence of categories in 1950. Right? So the very thing they're trying to put in is not what we know about functors and natural classification. It's just the rudimentary part. It's not been used. It has been used by Kaplan and Eilenberg in a very successful way. They invented a new field of mathematics, homological algebra. By 1950, it started. It's also systematized algebraic topology with Eilenberg and Steenrod, with the foundations of algebraic topology. So it's seen as a convenient tool that you can actually use to organize things. And by 1950, Kaplan and Eilenberg have their work going on and they're creating something. But there's still this problem, which they don't know how to really solve. Oh, here's a fun picture. When members are, when they were students at l'École Normale Supérieure, those really young guys, where you have here Henri Cartan, André Weil. Well, René de Poissel is not very well known. He was one of the founding members. Charles Erasman, also a member of the first part of Bourbaki, left afterwards. Dieudonné, looks really funny when he was that young. Claude Chevalet, Pierre Samuel, who is not very well known either. And here again, Pierre Serre, who's not the founding member. Came well, yeah, I know what you mean. So Bourbaki's elements are not textbooks, nor are they research monographs. Bourbaki's goal is not to solve problems. It is to build new. It is not to build new theories. What they are trying to do is to develop mathematics, at least analysis. At that point, when they started, afterwards, they become more ambitious, so that all the terms that are about abstract structures and combinations of abstract structures, and all the relations that are expressible in these terms are transportable. So, for instance, they want to show, they work on topological groups, and they want to show you how classical theorems are in fact provable from combinations of these three big family of structures, the three C's, the continuity, topological structures, combinations, algebraic structures, and comparison, order structures. And for them, that's sort of a way of thinking about the basic structures of mathematics. And then reconstruct the whole fields of mathematics from this structural standpoint, which is not obvious. And they spend hours doing it, and they work hard. It's really crazy what they do. And they come up with this. So, this is just a break. Just to show you what you find when you read that Hebrew, for instance, or Bourbaki. So they come up with a poem about funk in the early 1950s, because Cartan is working with Eilenberg and doing homological algebra, and functors are everywhere. So they come with it. I won't read the poem now. If you want to meet you, I translated it. It's the original is here in Hebrew, and here it is. But it's just really, this is the spirit of Bourbaki. It's just nuts. Young guys going nuts, doing silly things, and really silly things. That's something.
You should say it way too fast. So we read it night.
Well, I'll read it afterwards. Before I go on like it, just one parenthesis. I told you I was going to tell you this. So they start with this idea that mathematics is about abstract structures. They want to show how this can be built in set. They come up with the idea of a species of structures and the idea that from a mathematical standpoint, you have this principle that you have to build in theories right from the start. It's very awkward. The notion of a species is really complicated and it's not very elegant. And they cannot agree on one way of presenting it. Okay. And they'll disagree for about 20 years about it, as how to write it down. And so when they started, things seemed to be simple, and then categories came along, and there was a new problem. They didn't see how they could actually put categories in. So for the last 5 years, from 1950 to 1955, approximately, when they finally decided that they will print the volume of step theory, it's been there for so long, so we have to send it to the printer. Then they will just sort of give up and they think about where are we going to put categories in this volume? Do we put it in the set theory volume or do we put them in the homological algebra as the first chapter, or we put categories in another chapter we're planning on algebra and geometry? And we finally sort of put it in bits and pieces in the first volume on sets, but not officially. So it's really awkward. And afterwards they will say, well, we really didn't do a good job. We really didn't think this through, but we were in the middle of our project and we had published so many volumes on topology, algebra, and topological vector spaces. We couldn't start all over again. Well, perhaps we should have. Okay. And this is where Grothendieck comes. So just as we were told, but I think we should underline this fact. So Grothendieck studied and worked with Bourbaki's members from the very beginning when arriving in Paris. So he went to Nancy and worked with Dieudonné and Schwartz. Dieudonné being one of the founding fathers and Schwartz being, of course, one of the members, famous members joining Bourbaki a little later on in the mid-40s. And we all know the story. And of course, Pierre, which was a very basic and profound influence on him. If we look at the history, we find out that Grothendieck is invited as what Bourbaki called a guinea pig. Okay, so they invited students at their meetings, and they were really treated as guinea pigs. They were testing the students and just trying to see whether they could be members of Bourbaki or not. So if you were invited as a guinea pig, you knew you would have a rough time. Okay, so Grothendieck was invited in 1950, very early on, okay, but he had already solved all these problems by Dieudonné and Schwartz, I suppose, so they had to invite him. Vail, I mentioned, it was not at the meeting because it didn't go well between Vail and Grothendieck. And this is important for one little bit of the story. In 1952, he was again present as a guest because they had to work on their volume on topological vector spaces. And who knew topological vector spaces better than Grothendieck? So they invited him. And it didn't go very well, but it's very funny when you read the compte rendu, but he's already there and works with them. So this is how he kept up. At the 1952 meeting, one reads that Cartan is accused of being unconsciously of bad faith. And a verse on Alexandrin in French captures his mistakes. And the verse in French is Qui sème le functeur récolte la structure, which I translated by who sows the functor reaps the structure. Okay, so this is 1952. So homological algebra is right there. And it's talked about by Bourbaki. They know about it. So functors are there, but you don't like functors. I'll come back to that. Grothendieck is there at that meeting, okay, to talk about topological vector space. Here's another joke, which is quite interesting. Michael Barr pointed that out to me. I don't know whether it's true, but it's funny to read it in the compte rendu de la Tribune. The logicians told Grothendieck that even if all empty sets are equal, some are more equal than others. Apparently, then Grothendieck became berserk and he left the meeting for Nancy. And the story is that Michael Barr told me that Grothendieck didn't like the empty set. And if you look at his definitions, he doesn't include it. It's always not empty. It's not empty. It's not empty. And this is bizarre, but apparently it's all there. So I wanted to check, but I was not curious. Okay, this is pieces of history. In June 1954, Bourbaki decides that Grothendieck will officially become a member. At the meeting of February-March 1955, one reads, the structures are broken down. This is their sectional structures. 1955 is like, shit, that's not working. Been working for 20 years on this. It's like falling apart. At the next meeting, that's in Chicago, there's a lot of discussion about algebraic geometry, and they're stuck. Chevalier has this notion of schemes, and it's inspired by Nagata, and they're trying to find an abstract notion of variety, and they can't find one, and they discuss, and it's really going crazy. At the fall meeting in 55, Grothendieck is officially a member, and he has to write something about Sheaves homology. Okay, so already it's there. So the whole plan about structures fall apart in 1956. This is Pierre. So he's part of the reasons why it didn't fall, but this is very, very interesting. And that shows the whole problem here. An article by Cartier shows that Samuel's results on inductive limits are special cases of ultra general stuff. think that's category theory, on community of universal problems. This stuff can be stated clearly in the context of categories and functors. Cartier proposes a meta-mathematical method to introduce the latter without modifying our logical system. That's Bourbaki's. But the system is vomited. This is really in the text. Since it turns its back to the extensional point of view, and above all, because with it, it often becomes impossible without making considerable mental efforts to tell whether we're doing mathematics, meta-mathematics, or even meta-meta-mathematics. So Vail is pushing the idea that category theory is not math. It is meta. Grothendieck will disagree. It is therefore decided that it is preferable to enlarge the system to bring in categories. At first sight, Gödel's system seems to be appropriate in order to avoid to have to butt between two chairs. That's a French expression. I don't know. I translated that, but it's in French. It's le cul en deux chaises. So this is typical Bourbaki again. And also not to postpone the publication of a chapter on which we have worked a lot. That's a chapter on structures in the set theory book. We decided, in spite of Dixmier's veto. So you have to know that when Bourbaki worked, every member had a veto. So you could raise your hand and say, I disagree, I don't want this to be published. That was it. They stopped and they had to start again. And so now they were ready to go to print, and Dixmier said, I don't like it. And they convinced him that no, we're not trying to do another version again. It's going to the print. It's the only time when this happened. To send chapter 4, that's on structures, to print. As for categories and functors, we're finally convinced that it is very important. That's it. They don't know where to put categories and functors at that point. Chapter 5, that's the plan at that point. Categories and functors. To start with, Grothendieck will write a kind of leaflet of results in a naive style, so that Bourbaki realizes that what it is useful to be able to do, we will then form. This is in La Tribu. That's the plan. 1956, 24 of June, Bourbaki is still stuck. That's algebraic geometry. Now, it's really fun to read. For the last time, perhaps, we heard one of the participants, congressist in French, shouting while the specialists were arguing about the notion of variety. It is as if atheists attended a dispute of theologians. It is decided that it is urgent to put some order in the terminology. So the obsession with terminology is already in Bourbaki. It's also in Grothendieck. It's already in Bourbaki. The notation, the words. Grothendieck is asked to write the abstract chapter on variety, and on what that various kinds of varieties have in common from the abstract point of view. All right, 1957, a year later. The book on varieties now requires categorical preliminaries, algebraic and analytic, which do not appear in the existing books. Roughly, functors, categories, sheaves and fibered spaces, inductive limits, the algebras, nuclear spaces. This is Grothendieck, okay? And all the algebra which is indispensable to operate la machine de Grothendieck, Grothendieck's machinery. In 1957. So they were well aware of what he's doing, and he's doing a machine. Okay, and this is important also. 1958, book on algebraic topology. Samuel Eilenberg, makes the speech, Laïus in French, blah, 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 blah. Since homological algebra is still being generalized, 1958, okay, and all this work. It is decided to wait before writing it. Samy then tries to sell a carpet. They always talk about Samuel Eilenberg as a carpet seller. Like he's trying to sell carpets. This is Bourbaki. Selling a carpet on the logical foundations of categories and functors. That Tribu does not reproduce it. Then it was vomited again. We're waiting for a paper from Lacombe, who was a logician, who was consulted by Serre and Dixmier on the advice of logicians. That will be a mistake. That's when Grothendieck will just leave. At that point, Grothendieck is expected to produce a report on algebraic geometry with Dieudonné. Right? So this is very clear. 1959, a year later, the wonderful theory of universes, okay, acclaimed by all, Cartan's dissenting, now allows us to write categories in a convenient mathematical framework. It's just convenient. During the Congress, the theory of universes has been enriched with pleasant compliments that our readers will find in a short paper entitled Univers, Ensemble Artinien, et Cardinal. This is Grothendieck's solution to the problem of categories in Bourbaki's framework. Okay? And I emphasize in Bourbaki's framework. Here's a way to do this. Maybe we can do that. And here's how. It's very simple and elegant. And it wrestles with one principle that I won't be talking about. Finally, 59 a little later, we have a framework of universes, and Grothendieck has shown during the Congress. Here's very surprising, 1959. Any abelian category admits a faithful and exact functor in the category of abelian groups. So he has this representation theorem early on, which he has in public. That's what I'm saying. Okay. And then I learned that Grothendieck is no longer a member of Bourbaki. 1961. It is a scandal that Bourbaki not only is he not at the forefront of the functorial movement, but he is not even at the tail end. If some of the founding fathers, Henri explicitly mentioned it, want to reconsider the refrain from influencing Bourbaki in the direction he wants to take, they should say so explicitly. And that's when Grothendieck left. There was a clash, okay? And Grothendieck explicitly said, it is certain that categories, functors, homomorphism of functors, natural transformations, so on and so forth, ought to be considered as mathematical objects that one can really quantify over and that can be considered elements of sets. So he is working in a set theoretical framework, as Kevin mentioned. This is necessary for two reasons: to apply without constraints the usual mathematical modes of reasoning to functors, blah, blah, blah. Many mathematical structures are naturally expressed as functors. That will become the key ingredient. Now I want to turn to Grothendieck. So Grothendieck, in contrast with Bourbaki, is always goal-oriented, at least in this period, up to 1970. Okay? From Giordani-Schwarz problems to the Weil conjectures, Grothendieck's aim is to solve these problems. Of course, as we all know here, his method is idiosyncratic. It is called the method of rising sea. I won't talk about this, although I hope Colin will say a few words about this. But it's basically, I will say, a methodological principle. So it is a claim, one formulation that I present to you, is that every problem has a proper context. And when it is put in that context, its solution follows from a series of straightforward steps. Okay. He emphasizes from very early on the idea that he's using the functorial, and I emphasize here, language, okay, in the strong sense of the word, and not category theory or the theory of functors, but the language of functors. Here's a quote from 1955 in the paper from Kansas on a general theory of fiber spaces with structure sheaf, which is a very nice paper with no example. In this one, zero example, and he says so explicitly, there are no examples. The first 4 chapters contain merely the first definitions concerning general fiber spaces, sheaves, fiber space with composition law, including sheaves of groups, and fiber spaces with structure sheaf. The functor aspect of the notions dealt with has been stressed throughout, as it now appears, later, should have been stressed even more, as the proofs of most of the facts stated reduce, of course, to straightforward verifications. They are only sketched and even admitted, the important point being merely a consistent order in the statement of the main facts. Once you've written everything in that language, you just order things properly, all the proofs are just straightforward. This is typical Grothendieck. So this is in contrast with, I think, it's very important, even MacLean 1950, the very important paper on abelian categories, Eilenberg and Steenrod on homological foundations of algebraic topology, Cartan Eilenberg on homological algebra, and even Buxbaum, 1954, on abelian category, they're not working the same way. To talk about the functorial language as a language that you can use to talk about anything, particularly mathematical, I think is typical of Grothendieck and unique to him. And I want to emphasize, like any proper language, it has its own grammar, and it allows for certain expressions and the formulations of certain facts, which are not easily expressible in a different. Most importantly, it is seen by him from the very beginning as an abstraction from the set theoretical language, i.e., any concept expressible in the set theoretical language can be expressed in the functorial language, and the latter is more expressive. Okay, all the notions that he does, for instance, in the Hoku paper, when he sets up the whole thing, he just translates standard set theoretical concepts about functions and structures, and they're now in the language. But in fact, we should talk about language. And he says so himself, and he does himself. He uses many different languages at different times. For instance, there's the functorial language, the language of schemes, the language of toposes, and he uses those expressions himself. They're seen as languages all the time, sometimes as theories also. These languages are developed from the functorial language. These languages all have, at least at first, specific purposes. For instance, schemes for algebraic geometry, toposes for topology and cohomology theories, and so on and so forth. But as a language, the functorial language and the others allow for the creation, I insist upon this, and Arnaldo also mentioned this, of new mathematical objects and the statements of new mathematical facts. It also incorporates explicitly all of Bourbaki's structures in that language. So he builds on modules, rings, topological spaces, local rings. And so these are all Bourbaki's stuff that he's actually using all the time. Genuinely new structures are also introduced, but it is not to say that anything goes. You have your language, you can combine things, you can use that as we do in English or in French. If you're a kid, you invent new stuff by combining words, you invent beasts, you invent stuff that do not exist. So you could do that in any language, and you could do that in category theory. You could do that in set theory, okay? But it's not that these objects are fictions, okay? So given the language in an informal sense here, like he is using it, he's not talking about the formal language. The combinatorial possibility is inherent to its grammar, allowing us to conjure various kinds of fictitious entities. The functorial language encounter, and this is important, its own resistance, because he's using it on something that is already there. He wants to solve the biology. He wants to talk about modules, rings, and variety. So he has to always capture that, and he has to bring it up in this new language. So there is resistance. It's not as if he's just using a new language and saying, what could I do? That's not what he's doing. He's not freely creating structures. He's just using that to express things that he wants to develop in a new context. A great mathematician like Grothendieck not only builds the language, but also knows what are the fruitful, proper, useful, whatever you want to use, combinations that are allowed. And here I want to connect this with what Bourbaki has done with the methodological principle that if you build a theory, it has to be done up to isomorphism. Well, Grothendieck inherits, and he will use this all the time in novel ways. Okay? And I want to emphasize this. Once the grammar of the language has been clarified, one still has to determine what makes sense and what does not in that language. Kevin mentioned this by saying if you change the equality and you loosen the equality, then you restrict the properties you'll have to use. That's what it means. Okay, now you have to make sure that your language is restricted in certain ways, and you can say things, and there are things you cannot say also. Furthermore, given the level of abstraction of the language developed, reference is a complicated business and completely different from what one finds in set theory, for instance, as Kevin showed. And this is a very important issue. From a foundational standpoint, set theory is very clean. Philosophers like, or logicians with a philosophical stance will like set theory because it fixes the reference. And sense is very simple. It's given by extension. But once you introduce abstract entities, reference becomes a very tricky thing. What are you talking about? And what is sense if it's not given by an extension? Now you have a new philosophical problems. And I don't think we have a solution to those right now. And I think it's a real challenge now to give an answer from mathematical practice, which is immersed by this abstract structures, not only Grothendieck, but all the others, to try to clarify what is meaning in mathematics and what is reference, how it works in this context. All right. I claim that Grothendieck, in contrast to Bourbaki, does not use the abstract method. Okay, now I will challenge you. He does not start with a variety of examples and then abstract their common properties that are then presented as axioms. And this is how Bourbaki presents what he's doing from an historical standpoint. And I claim that Grothendieck is not doing it. Not at all. At least that's not how he's presenting it. It is well known that in contrast, and now we have to discuss this. Grothendieck rarely give examples or work with examples in his papers. The early papers, at least, I didn't find many examples of the kind that one usually finds. It's usually examples that we'll talk about in a little bit. I would claim here that Grothendieck uses the functorial language to design, in a very strong sense, mathematical structures that are extraordinarily flexible. Okay? Which was not what Bourbaki was doing at all. Bourbaki came up with families of structures. They're fixed. Logical structures, algebraic structures, ordered structures. This is not what Grothendieck is doing. Even in the axiomatic, he's doing something completely different. He's doing what I would call conceptualism. So what is this? So I'll just skim through it. So here's a standard definition of design given by the design council. There is such a thing, the design council. Design could be viewed as an activity that translates an idea into a blueprint for something useful. Wow, I mean, this is Grothendieck at work, isn't it? There's another definition given by Alexander, a design theorist. It is based on the idea that every design problem begins with an effort to achieve fitness between two entities, the form in question and its context. The form is the solution to the problem. Whoa, I like this. This is Grothendieck form. The context defines the problem. In other words, the real object of design is not the form alone, but the ensemble comprising the form. That's it. I won't say anything more than that. It's not a mathematician. It's Alexander, another guy working on this. So a good design provides a good fit between the function, the role, the purpose, whatever. I'm not talking about mathematical function. Of the object design, the user, and the context. It makes sense to talk about a good design, a beautiful design, live in a proper, which was used by Bourbaki, but it is always relative to a user and a context. Change the context, the design is not no good anymore. You have to start all over from scratch. If designing one starts with prototypes, and sometimes it is necessary to step back and start again, which was done by Grothendieck many times. And even he mentions how Sartre tried to solve the triangle homology in 1950. It didn't work. It wasn't quite good. Good idea though. I'll pick it up and I'll just push it. And I'll I'll propose something else, which will work. Well, not quite. I have to do the right categories now. And then I have to triangulate the categories. Okay, now we're getting to it. Now I get toposes. Okay, yeah, now we're almost there. Okay. Grothendieck does not design singular objects like we think of designs in the time, but rather abstract objects that are such that, and this is the important thing that I mentioned earlier, if one specifies certain parameters, one falls back on well-known structures that can be very different from one. And if you read the early papers by Grothendieck, he does that all the time. So he defines schemes, but if you specify that ring, But he mentioned you have this whole spectrum that just follows blind that you all have suddenly by just fixing certain parameters. And he always does that. That's the way he thinks all the time. Okay, and that's not Bourbaki. That's completely. The beauty and surprise is that one can prove mathematically significant facts about these design abstract objects. Even at that level, you can already prove things. Hoku 10.1. What was it? The first theorem that you mentioned earlier on adjectives in abelian categories, which was Michael Marr told me. Okay, this is the very first theorem that convinced us that category theory could be used to do mathematics and not mathematics. Here's a real mathematical result from an abstract structure, a categorical structure. The terminology itself reflects the flexible nature of these objects. Schemes. This is what the scheme. The scheme is not something tangible. It's something that then you use to design or get other things. Toposes. This is just a place. So the choice of the word is very significant, even at that level. Okay. And the examples are everywhere. Abelian categories. This is an extraordinarily elegant axiomatic presentation. If you compare Grothendieck's works with Buchsbaum's, they're completely different. Grothendieck is so elegant, so clean, and so useful. Buchsbaum is a mess. Okay, in comparison, schemes. It's not an axiomatic definition. They're not presented axiomatic. Derived categories and triangulated categories with Peltier. I could give you examples, but I'll just give one. Toposes, which is something really we're thinking. I mean, when I was a student, I first learned elementary. So I give an axiom. Start from there, then you go to sheaves, and then you get Grothendieck. And when you go to Grothendieck, in the book, SGA, you see this. What is a topos? A topos is a category E. If there exists a site, such that E is equivalent to the category, the functorial category set through C on sheaves of C. This is not an axiomatic definition. And it uses the equivalence as built in the definition itself. So it doesn't matter how you construct your stuff, but actually there's a whole lot here. The notion of this thing here is a very complicated thing. Notion of a site, and then functorial category on sets. You have to untangle all this to actually understand what it means. But as such, it's very opaque. Okay. Of course, there's Giraud's theorem, okay, which gives you axioms and clarifies all this, but it's almost inapplicable. But it is an operational definition. It tells you how to build toposes in a very concrete way. If you know what a site is, if you know what a functorial category is, you know how to do these things, then you have a real handle on this. Very clear. Nothing is abstracted here. It doesn't proceed that way. Okay? It's not the way it is presented at all. And you have to understand the native language. I'm almost done.
No.
Oh,
You want to admit the guy.
oh, okay. So someone is trying to.
Yeah.
So Bourbaki's abstract mathematical structuralism rests upon a meta-mathematical principle. It is built in the grammar of theory. If you read Bourbaki chapter 4, if you read carefully, you will see that. Okay. In the end, mathematics is developed up to isomorphism in Bourbaki's framework. It is done that. That's how mathematics, abstract mathematics, ought to be done. Okay. Canonical maps are everywhere in Bourbaki's. Okay, that's important. Grothendieck takes it from. Even the term canonical is a joke. Or in Bourbaki's mind. It comes from, if you read La Tribu, it's cahier œcuménique, which is a joke. I mean, they're really referring to the Pope and the church. It's as if they were a church. And canonical is sort of comes from the text. And it comes from the Bible. So Bourbaki is making fun of himself. Well, the elements are sort of the Bible of mathematics, and it's just canonical stuff. It's a joke, but it's everywhere. They use it themselves. Canonical maps, canonical maps, canonical maps. You know, it's everywhere in Bourbaki. But of course, it's also everywhere in Grothendieck. Bourbaki shows, and I mentioned this, how classical results can be obtained from the combination of abstract structures, sometimes referred as the mother structure. Whereas Grothendieck shows how many results obtained by Bourbaki and the Bourbakists can be obtained from the adoption of the right language and setting certain parameters. And if you read Bourbaki at the beginning, he always referred to, oh, here's Serre's theorem. It's just a simple corollary from my theorem. And here's Shimoda's varieties. This is just a corollary of my work. And here's the one, oh, this is also a corollary of my theorem. And he does it all the time. Okay, if you fix this parameter, you get Serre's. If you fix this other parameter, you'll get Shimoda's. If you fix this other, you'll get Spencer, whatever. Okay, this is what he does in the beginning. Grothendieck does not specify a general mathematical framework with respect to structures. Universes are not meant for that. And this is Kevin's point. I mean, he doesn't do that. Bourbaki really takes care of setting up the foundational framework, tries to, takes care to gives a transfer principle and meaning what it means, how it should be used. Grothendieck doesn't care about that at all. He just works this way. More importantly, when one moves to categories themselves, the right notion of isomorphism is the notion of equivalence of categories, which Grothendieck uses explicitly. We saw the definition of a topos. It's there. What is a topos? Well, it's a category that is presented this way, equivalent to the category. So up to equivalence, already in the definition. It's built in. Okay. Now, Grothendieck introduces new level of abstract structures and works up to isomorphism all the time. And here, isomorphisms mean isomorphisms in the interpretation of isomorphisms in that context. It could be set theoretical isomorphisms, it can be equivalence, but then it can be two equivalents and so on and so forth. They're all fundamental or revolutionary changes, new languages, new criteria of identity, new methods of definitions, new methods of proof, new ways of dealing with sense of reference. In other words, entirely new mathematics that we were left. And this is what his legacy is for us to think about, for mathematicians to work with, but for philosophers to think about. We reflect like the Nanda has been doing for many years now, and that we have to deal with, and it's a real challenge that he has offered us. Not only him, but he's certainly one of the few who pushed it in a certain direction. I should mention also, to start to finish this, that we talked about equality and the problem of equality in the foundations. Coming from Montreal, as you know, that Michael Marquis has been pushing a certain point of view on this for 20 years. So he published a paper in 1995 or 1998, but he actually wrote it down in 1995, which is based on first order logic with dependent sorts, which was influential for Vygotsky and his approach to multiple type theory. But Michael is still working on this. And it is precisely this idea that when you move up in categories, the equality changes, so the language becomes poorer, well, less things that you can say about them. But there's a logic, an underlying logic at work that one has to clarify in the same way that, well, like he did. So what Michael is trying to pose is a framework in which you would have a theory in which the principle of isomorphism is satisfied, provably so. So that if you use the language, the grammar will force you to write things and only things that make sense in that language and are invariant in their isomorphism, the right ones. Which was done by Bourbaki, but not from a foundational perspective, at least in the logical sense. Okay, on that. Thank you very much.